100 years of progress there. This was my starting point. And I started thinking about how we could sum it up and how we could really feel that International Day of the Midwife. So I had a little think. And this is what I was sort of coming up with, really. And when you think about history, you think about these, well, you can see in this slide the redoubtable women that started the movement to legislation in the UK in 1902. The group there was the Institute of Midwives that later became the Royal College of Midwives, and what a redoubtable group of women they were, and how they had to be to get the legislation through, which brought us standards, education, and the practice that we have today. Obviously not the same then, but that was the groundwork they did. And I found these other wee pictures of older midwives. Well, they weren't old, they probably were younger than me now, but a midwife on the bicycle, she had all her equipment for inhalation analgesia in that little black box at the back, which I thought was rather fine. Must have been very difficult. Nowadays, we just pop it in the back of the car and off we go. But in those days, you had to use your own legs to move about, and it must have been very hard. And then we've moved a bit closer to our own time. And I rather like this picture. These student nurses, I think, because I think in this particular era, which I think was probably 1950s, you would not have had male midwives. So I know it's a nursing clip, though of course nowadays we do have male midwives, and we do learn all the things that we would have learned as nurses before we became midwives, i.e. like the skeleton. And then we have a picture of neonatal care, and you can see the great big pipes of oxygen or tanks of oxygen standing by. And again, we're very fortunate because we have all that piped into the hospitals, mostly where we're practicing. It's much more easy. So things have changed a lot. So we have all the things like blood transfusion, antibiotics, that these people right at the beginning didn't have. And the growth of midwifery education shows how our practice developed alongside, because right at the beginning of the century, we could get through a course within 3 months, get all our knowledge in 3 months, have a 3-hour written examination, a little bit of a 15-minute viva, conducted obviously by an obstetrician, and you get your certificate. 3 months, can you imagine now? And then it moved to 6 months and a certificate, and then a year for non-nurses, and then to this idea of 2 parts of the training. And you will have met colleagues who might have done this part 1 and part 2 midwifery education, where you did a 6-month period in a hospital and then 6 months in the community. Very different. And then in 1968, it was 1 year for nurses. So the nurses would do their 3-year training and then a year's top up, or a 2-year direct entry. And it stayed about the same until the 1980s, really. Now, I've put this picture. This is me as a nurse, and it occurred to me as I was talking to some midwife colleagues of mine, and we got talking about history, and we started talking about hats and strings, and these little bows under my chin were my strings. And they were not attached to the hat at all. They had to be strung up underneath the hat. But I was very proud of my hat and very proud of my strings. And this always reminds me, this image, that I wasn't set out to be a midwife. I never wanted particularly to be a midwife. I was going to be a surgical nurse. I wanted to be a surgical sister. And at that time, in order to get any further up in the hierarchy, you had to do your midwifery. So a lot of people did the nursing, then went off and did midwifery, and then came back into nursing. And I did my midwifery. Here I am. This is quite a long time ago. Still with hats, notice, and very task-driven. It was a time of enemas for women before they started labour, of shaving, pubic shaving, and then the ubiquitous 2-minute each side breastfeeding, which we call demand feeding, because the baby could demand it as often as he wanted, but it was basically you fed the baby 2 minutes each side for the first couple of days, and then you moved to 3 minutes and 5 minutes, which must have been terribly frustrating for those poor babies and for the mothers. But we thought we were doing the right thing, and we were trying desperately to give really good care. The good thing about that time was we had a lot of practical learning and a lot of problem solving in practice, though we didn't have as much theoretical information, because there was no theory at that point that was used very much. We didn't have research much in that at that time. That just shows how old I am, my dear listeners and watchers. But I enjoyed my training, but I wasn't going to stay as a midwife. And then suddenly I found, actually, I went back to nursing for a wee while, and I really missed it, because it was very different, very, very different being a midwife and a nurse. And that's not to say being a nurse was less autonomous, though I think it probably was at that time. It was just very different. I missed the mothers, I missed the babies, and I missed supporting women, and not just during labor and having their babies, but also through the antenatal period and the postnatal, which was always my love, because I think women need so much confidence at that time and so much understanding of that baby. And it's a wonderful, wonderful time. And these images are taken from when I was working in Weymouth in Dorset. Some of you will have heard of it. And we really did have true continuity of care there, because I could work in the morning in an antenatal clinic. By lunchtime, I might be in the delivery suite. It was a very small ward. And then I might be doing postnatal by the afternoon. It really was like that. And that was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. We knew our women very well. We knew the babies very well. And at that time, then I did my advanced diploma of midwifery, and I was introduced to research. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. That really opened my eyes to a very different way of working and thinking, and a huge amount of confidence. Those of you who are very lucky, who've been training recently, will have had all that lovely knowledge right from the start. But for me as a midwife, being introduced to questioning everything we did, and knowing that there was some research somewhere, and for some things there wasn't research, but some things there were, it was a huge eye-opener and really, really exciting. And I just remember that feeling of excitement. Now, the other picture at the bottom with me in a very long frock, this doesn't mean I was a midwife in Victorian times. We decided at Christmas, or I kind of decided, it was kind of my idea, that we'd dress up and do something different at Christmas, because in those days we used to do that sort of thing. I'm not sure we have all the time and the energy to do it these days, but maybe you'll tell me I'm wrong. So in the 1990s, surprise, and very much surprise to me, because I was never going to be I wasn't going to be a midwife first, and then I wasn't going to be a teacher. And suddenly I found I wanted to become a teacher, and I became a teacher. And then I got involved in designing one of the first direct entry midwifery courses in the country. There were 7 started. And at that time, there was only one course in the whole country for direct entrant midwives. One course. Everything else was for the shortened course. And at that time, we had to work with a higher education university in order that our students, and this is my first lovely group of student midwives undertaking the direct entry course, becoming higher education diplomates. It was very exciting. And it was a time when we were moving and we were teaching about research at that point. And it was a very exciting time. And the picture on the left of the screen is my wonderful colleagues who were in practice. We worked very closely together. One of the lovely things was teaching in the classroom, and then I might be called to do an antenatal clinic, and that was lovely. Really enjoyed that. And that's very special as a midwife teacher, to be very much part of the clinical scene. Really enjoyed that. And then we come on to the 2000s, and I've got a more modern picture now. You saw the picture of me with a group of 6 of us. That was a whole group of student midwives, 6. And nowadays you'll have a huge group. You might have 50, you might have 60, much, much bigger. But I know that my teacher colleagues really try to make sure that the experience students get is as individual as it can be and as rich as it can be. The other thing is there's been huge growth of masters and PhD possibilities for midwives. We have many midwives now who've got PhDs, and what a delight that is, because that means they've got the confidence, they've also got the drive to move midwifery questions into research, which is really important. We then had, actually at that point, a little bit before that, we had the Winterson report on changing childbirth, and that brought in continuity of care for women and families. And you'll remember that from many weeks we've had on the maternity hour, we've talked about continuity a lot. It's not necessarily a new thing. It's something women have wanted for a long time, midwives have wanted for a long time. At that point, we had increasing home birth, we had more continuity of care schemes and projects. Though I have to say at that time, many weren't funded. We were just moving things around to try and squeeze a project in. So you had a continuity of care group, or you had a group practice working, a home birth group, and you just had to work within what you had. And it worked until people left, and then, you know, workload took over a little bit and people got pulled into the labour ward, which never works very well. And then we've had increasingly more direct entry midwives, and now we have more than the shortened programme, which is the way it should be. It's a much more effective way of training and educating midwives, and it's really lovely to see. Of course, in those 2000s, we've had more visibility of midwives in the media, and that's because I think the professional bodies were much more visible, and people are very interested in midwives. You can see the Call the Midwife drama. People love it because midwifery is such a wonderful job. You and I know it's a wonderful job. Women are interested in it, men are interested in it, people are interested in it, and we need to use that to really share the joy of midwifery, not just the difficulties we have. And of course, then we had the Better Births report. Now that followed a big national review of maternity care, asking women and families what they wanted from maternity services. A little like the Changing Childbirth report, only even more so. And what they wanted were the same sort of things. They wanted continuity. They wanted more choice about where they gave birth. They wanted more choice about home births, and they wanted to have a say in everything. So that's where we came from. Now, of course, my brain starts moving on to textbooks and history, because you will know that I'm editing at the moment this large book, The Maze Midwifery, by my side at all times. And I just wanted to share, well, when I was training, we had a very thin textbook, and it didn't have half as much as they have now. You look at the thickness of that, it's a big book. They get bigger and they change with knowledge and practice, and they have materials online. And I have to say, they're not just for students, they're for midwives, they're for people who are interested in maternity care, because they've got lots of information that people can use. And I'm always surprised when students want to sell them after they do their course, because I always kept mine, and especially my dictionary, very, very handy as a qualified midwife, actually. So coming up to 2019, 2022, well, what happened? Well, COVID hit us. And hasn't it changed our lives? And I know folk want to go back to normal, whatever normal is, but it has changed. And we're going to have to look very much at the taken for granted now, and use some of the things that we've learned over that period to ensure quality care. Because some of the things we've tried out, because we've had to, actually are much more effective. Women like them, students like them, midwives like them. So we need to be quite creative, but we also need to be quite careful about choosing what we keep and what we go back to normal with. And we need to keep the learning. And of course, at that time, I know that the birth and maternity hour has started, because we started with the pandemic, and the festivals that we were doing very much face to face have become very much hybrid. We're moving back to face, but there still is a hybrid element, which means that everybody can access wherever they are. Even if they're working, they can access. And as you know, everything is recorded to help that by. So we're quite an interesting time in our history. We have a whole series of reports of poor care, of poor leadership and lack of communication, especially the most recent one from Donna Ockenden this year, that gives us a lot of messages of things we need to do, and we need energy to do these things. We also, a huge thing we have to do is challenge the disparity in health outcomes for Black and brown women and babies. Huge problems. And that starts from doing some of the things in the curriculum, even the images that we use. And we've found this, Gail Johnson and I, when we've been looking at the Maze Midwifery, it's very difficult to get proper images so that we balance and we make sure that anyone who is learning has that knowledge of what's appropriate for women of colour and what's appropriate for white women, and what we can do to make the care more equal and better for all, but certainly to make it more equitable for our Black and brown women and babies. And we will learn and develop from the bad reports, and we hopefully will get some good reports which might balance those out. And we do need to focus on great leadership. We have got some fantastic leaders in midwifery. We need more, and we need to acknowledge that leadership isn't just the people at the top, it's all the way through the profession. And we need to nurture people. We nurture them right from the maternity care support workers to the student midwives to the more clinical midwives, teachers. Everybody needs to really unleash their leadership potential and really work on that. We need to focus so much on what women and families want, using things like the better birth, the best start, but also we must listen to women. We must listen to what they want and what works for them, because each woman, each family needs something a bit different, and we need to really do what we've said for years we do individualized care. We really need to come up to the plate and do that now. We need to really work on continuity of care, because that's the most safe and personalized care you can get. But obviously you need good staffing levels for that, because otherwise it's going to be really difficult to do. And that's been made very clear. And I know that the transformation program have really emphasized that in order to get your building blocks for your continuity models, you must have enough staff. We need to develop our research and apply it and use the evidence in maternity care and services for the women and the babies in our care. We also need to develop our interprofessional team working, and I know in many units that works very well, and people are kind of puzzled when another trust isn't working so closely, but we don't take it for granted. We need to keep working at it. And we also need to look at our workplace culture, making it better, retaining our midwives, our students and our support staff, and making the environment a really nourishing, learning, good place to be for our workforce, but also for the women and the families. We need it to feel welcoming and warm and friendly all the way through. Now, we've been 100 years of progress. I've scampered through it and I've really focused on my own part in my own little history, but you might want to do this for yourself. Now, I've got marvelous midwives here, and these are only some voices in face of midwifery. I just started thinking about the people who've impacted on me and my practice and my knowledge. And this is just a fragment of them, actually, because as I was putting these down and seeing these phases and thinking, oh, yes, I remember Billy Hunter, the tale of the midwife, and I can remember Tracy talking about the continuity, and Marlin talking about technology, and Carleen being such a brilliant politician, and Stephanie there with her baby, because she always talks about you need to focus on the baby. And then the wonderful Catherine Guttridge last week, fantastic, how fantastic she was. Each of these midwives has given something special and has a special voice, just as you do there, as you're listening and watching me. If you do this for yourself, do you just see how many wonderful midwives there are that you can put on your screen, and you can think of, these people really matter? Because as I was doing this, I was thinking, how lucky are we as midwives to have such tremendous people? And I'm emphasizing, because just in case you know me and you're not on here, it's not because you're not marvelous. It's because I was running out of space and I had a limited time to do this. And I'm going to add to this, and I'm going to make it bigger and bigger. And I'm going to share it with you a little bit later in the series, just so you can see, because I think it's going to become so that each little picture is tiny, but the impact they have is enormous. And I want to thank all of these wonderful midwives and all of you midwives for joining me this evening, because it's been fantastic for me to sort of reminisce and think about what matters to me and how I've got here in this bit of the history. And this is a bit of my history as well. And I always smile when I see this, because these are my Macedonian babies. When I did a project in Macedonia, and they were getting the babies, they were just cleaning the nursery and put all the babies in a lovely little bundle together before they went off to see the mums. And it just made me feel nothing really changes for us here. And I wanted just to emphasize to each of you, it's important, as we're looking at the International Day of the Midwife, we celebrate what it means for each one of us as a midwife to be that midwife. It's easy on a day-to-day basis. You're busy, you're rushing, you're skipping your lunch because you haven't got time to eat. You're trying to cover someone else's workload and working tremendously hard. Just take a minute and think about, what is the most joyful thing about being a midwife? What do you love about being a midwife? And what is close to you? And if you had that little board of midwives, who would you put there? And that I'm going to set that as a little bit of homework for you tonight, just to spend some time thinking, because this is what having an International Day of the Midwife is, because that's just mostly UK midwives. If I go and then start looking at international, that whole panel is going to be massive, massive. Now, I'm coming to the end of my little spiel, and I want to wish you a happy International Day of the Midwife. I want to remind you and say a big thank you to Matflix for looking after us, and for Amy, who's looked after me today with her editing and filming, and timing, kept me to time. And I want to say a big thank you to everyone for coming along this evening. And you'll have some resources there available on the website, and this will all be available on Facebook also on Friday. Now, next week on Maternity and Midwifery Hour, we're going back to kind of normal, and we're going to be doing a bit of a career spotlight, and we're going to have a little bit of how to plan careers. And it doesn't matter if you're halfway through your career or even at the end, you'll learn something, and we'll have someone talking about how they've got into their role too. And I'll tell you more about that a little closer to the time. Now, I need to also remind you, on the 8th of June, there's a personalised maternity care building on Ockenden whole festival conference, which is led by Dr. Claire Feely, but also has the lovely Baroness Cumberledge, has Maria Booker, Joan Crawford, Anna Madeley, Tracy Cooper, Becky Westbury, all men of people. It's going to be a fantastic day. If you can make it, book in now. Otherwise, in the north, Manchester, 21st of June is the next Maternity and Midwifery Festival. And again, register. It will be available online, but if you want to come face to face, we've got some really delicious things that you can only really enjoy face to face. And I'm not just talking about coffee and cake. And also Wales and Southwest is on the 13th of September. So to pop that in your diary as well. And just in the meantime, I'll say thank you again for coming this evening. Have a lovely day tomorrow. And I must refer you to the virtual International Day of the Midwife. Now there's a a link on the resources sheet. You go straight in, and they are having something at 8 o'clock. So that's in about a minute. And in the meantime, do stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next week.